Hey guys, what's going on? Today we're going to talk about the 4 ways that you can get on a college coach's radar. There really are only 4 of them. If you're doing something that doesn't fall into one of these 4 buckets, then you're probably just wasting money and time. So I'm going to walk you through what those things are, how they apply to you. So let's get rolling. All right, these are the 4 ways that you can get exposure in college recruiting. When I say exposure, really what I mean is that college coaches learn that you exist, right? We say that there are 3 pieces that you need in college recruiting if you want scholarships. You need talent. You have to be good enough to play at the next level. If you're not, no amount of marketing or exposure is going to solve that, right? The second thing you need is evidence. You need to actually prove that you are good enough. You can't just say it. You can't just think it or believe it. You have to actually have evidence and prove that you are good enough. And then the last piece, which is what we're talking about today, is exposure, right? You need enough college coaches to come across that evidence enough times. That's what exposure means. It just means that college coaches learn you exist, because right now there are hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of players that play your sport. And college coaches are trying to sift through all of those players to find the few that they actually need and want for their team. And so there's a really good chance that like 99%, maybe even 100% of college coaches don't even know you exist. And that's a problem, because you are not going to get any interest or scholarship offers if they don't even know that you exist. So there's 4 ways that you can get on a college coach's radar, and there's really only 4. If you're doing something that does not fall into one of these 4 buckets, you're probably wasting money and time. Okay, so we're gonna walk through these. The first thing is showcases and camps, okay? Now, this is usually the first place that parents run to in college recruiting, because they don't really know how to generate any interest. They don't have a game plan. They don't have a strategy. And so what they do is they replace strategy with money. They say, I don't know what to do, but I've heard of these things called showcases and there are college coaches there. So I'm just gonna start paying money and hopefully it works out. This is not a great plan, right? If you can't tell, this is just a huge gamble, and you're hoping that this is going to work out for you. Let me walk you through why I don't like to use showcases and camps as, and this would include tournaments, but recruiting events as your primary method of exposure. The first thing is that there are usually less than 50 college coaches in attendance, and that would be a pretty big tournament, right? You may have like an exception where there's like a national tournament where there might be like 100 coaches there or something. That's pretty rare, right? Most events that you're gonna go to are gonna have 10, 20 college coaches there, maybe something like that. So that is a limited amount of exposure, right? You're not getting mass exposure when you go to an event. You're getting 10 schools. So in order to get exposure to 100 schools, you then have to go to 10 different events, right? That is going to be a lot of time. It's going to be a lot of money. It's just not an efficient use of those resources. So you're not getting mass exposure when you go to showcases and tournaments. You actually also don't even know if they're watching your kid, right? They could be there, and just because they're in attendance doesn't mean that they actually ever see your kid play. There's so much that you cannot control at those events. It's like, wow, we're just hoping that the stars align and we just get lucky. And that's not a good game plan in college recruiting. There are usually hundreds of players that are there. And so if your kid needs to stand out amongst hundreds of players, that means that they have to do something so exceptional that a college coach takes notice and they're like, wow, look at this one player amongst hundreds of other ones. And just so we're clear, like, sports are hard, right? Like if you're a baseball player and you're a hitter and you get a hit 3 out of 10 times, you're hitting 300, that's Hall of Fame numbers, right? Baseball is a very difficult sport. That's true of like every sport. That's true of football and basketball and lacrosse and soccer and volleyball. It's true of literally all of them. Like, it's hard to perform at the top of your game every single time you go play. And so what you're asking of your kid when you're using showcases and tournaments and camps as your primary method of exposure is you are asking your kid to play at the top of their game in a high stakes game in a very small window where a lot of the cards are stacked against them. That does not sound like a great strategy to me. And this is part of the reason we don't recommend using showcases and camps as your primary method of exposure. They're also very expensive. For like a 1 to 2 day camp, I've seen them go up to like $800, right? For 2 days. And you have no idea if that's gonna give you an ROI or not. And it's literally 2 days. It's not like 2 months or 6 months or 12 months. It's 2 days. That's not a large, you're not giving yourself a big window for success. And of course, they're time consuming, right? Like if you're gonna go to a tournament or a showcase, you might drive a couple hours, you may get on a plane, you may get hotel rooms, and you're getting rental car. Like there's just a lot of time and money associated with that. So here's what I say instead. Showcases and tournaments and camps, recruiting events, are awesome for evaluation. They're not awesome for exposure. They're great for when a college coach knows who you are and they're trying to evaluate you as a player because they get to see you in person, but they're not great for learning about you in the first place, for learning that you exist. That's not what showcases and camps are for. And they have been sold to you as a parent in that way because it makes sense. It's like, college coaches don't know who my kid is. I'm going to go to this showcase where there are college coaches in attendance. If they play well, then we're going to get a bunch of interest from college coaches, so I will pay for this event. Except there's so many things that we don't talk about in there, like how do you know a college coach is watching your kid? How are you going to get your kid to stand out? What if they don't need your position in grad class? What if the college coach goes to the bathroom at the same time your kid does something amazing? What if he's talking to his buddy and he misses the play? Like there's so many things that are completely outside of your control. It's just not a safe bet, right? So we say showcases are for evaluation. They are not for exposure. Now, the second way that you can get on college coaches' radars is coach referral. This is where your high school coach, your travel coach, your club coach calls college coaches on your behalf and recommends you, okay? Now, this can be incredibly effective if your coach has clout, right? If your coach is super trusted and he or she has built relationships for many, many years, then this can be very effective. But there's two things about this. The first is that most coaches don't have that kind of clout, even if they tell you that they do. So there are very few people where these calls are actually going to matter and make a difference. But then the second thing is, even if they do have clout, they don't have time. They're not going to be able to go make 100 calls for you. They're just not going to. They may call 5. But remember, the promises that they made to you where they said, hey, we're going to get your kid exposure. I'm going to make calls on your behalf. I'm going to be working for you. Remember, they made that same commitment to every other player that's on your team and more probably. Right? And so if you start adding all of those up, 100 calls takes a lot of hours, and you start multiplying that by the number of players, and then you look at that time in a day where you have 24 hours, it's not feasible. It's not possible. They're not going to work like that on your behalf. No one is going to work as hard for you and fight for your kid as you are, right? And so they don't have the time to be able to do that. So coach referrals, again, a lot of parents say, I'm going to go to a bunch of showcases and camps. I'm going to rely on my coach to go connect us with a bunch of schools, and that is going to work out. But as we're seeing here, both of these options are not great for mass exposure. So you have a bunch of parents that are looking at each other going, how do we not have any interest? We're doing all the things that we're told to do. Yeah, because a lot of the regurgitated information out there about recruiting is garbage. You're doing things that everyone's telling you to do, but the people who are telling you to do those things don't know what they're talking about. Both of those two things, which is what most parents are using for primary methods of exposure, are terrible for mass exposure. So it's no wonder that you don't have the interest in offers that you were hoping for, right? Now, coach referrals are awesome for targeting specific schools. The top 5 schools on your list, if your coach has clout, have them call them. Those can work really, really well, but you're not going to go get 100 schools interested from that. It's just not used for that, right? Okay, so that's the second thing. Third thing is social media. When I talk about social media, I'm talking about it in terms of organic social media. I'm not talking about DMs. We're going to talk about that as the fourth thing, okay? Outbound messaging, we'll talk about that in a second. But when I talk about social media, I mean organic social media. That means that you are posting on a timeline, hoping that the algorithm shows it to college coaches see it, they like you, and then they reach out, right? That's what I mean when I say social media. Now, most social media is not worth your time in terms of recruiting, like TikTok, not worth your time. Instagram, not worth your time. Are there coaches on those platforms? Yes. Is that where you should be spending the majority of your time if you're looking for the 80-20 of college recruiting? No, it's not. Twitter is where it happens, okay? Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to call it Twitter because it's Twitter. I don't care what anyone says. So most of recruiting in terms of social media happens on Twitter. That's where you should be. That's where you should invest your time. Now, social media has one huge perk, and that huge perk is that it can and it has the ability to deliver a mass amount of exposure. If you have one post that absolutely rips, it hits. For whatever reason, you get the right people to like and comment and retweet at the right time, and the algorithm picks it up and it starts showing it to a bunch of college coaches. You could get 10 coaches interested overnight with one single post, right? You can potentially get a mass amount of exposure. What's the problem with social media? It's completely unpredictable. You may never get that one post that changes your recruiting process. It may never come, right? And so you cannot necessarily just rely on that delivering some sort of mass exposure to you, because you're just throwing Hail Marys out there. And that's what I like to use organic social media for. Yes, you should use organic social media, and I do hope that you get that one post that completely changes your recruiting process. But when it comes to those posts, they're not going to come that often, and they're completely unpredictable. So if you're waiting for that to happen, you may be waiting forever, which again is not a good strategy. So we put that as a tool in our tool belt where you're going to throw some Hail Marys on Twitter just to maybe hope that one of them hits, but we're not going to rely on that. The second thing that I would love to use social media for is what I call recency, right? This is just showing things that have happened recently. Here is the tournament that I played in last weekend. Here's my video. Here's my stats, right? You can say, here's the game that I played in last night, or hey, some route running from this morning, right? Or here's some BP from last night. So you can show recency because, again, that Twitter profile is going to act as your profile. Forget about these other profiles that, all these recruiting softwares that are like, hey, make a free profile. Yeah, guess what? There's already a free profile that's better optimized than all of those. It's called Twitter. So just use your Twitter profile as your profile. You already get a headshot photo, you get a banner photo, you get a bio, you can have a link there for your YouTube channel, whatever. You can pin a tweet, you get all the things that you're looking for anyway. You don't need to go do that on some other site. Just use Twitter. It's great for that, I promise. So you can use Twitter for recency. It's like, here's who I am as a player, as a student, as a person recently. Also, I'm not going to talk about organic social media right now and actually dive into how to do this, but you can be a normal high school athlete on Twitter. Like, you don't have to have a Twitter account that's just for sports. Like, college coaches know that you're a high school kid. They know that you're hanging out with other friends. They know that you're doing stuff. You can post stuff about that on Twitter. It's okay. Just make sure it's appropriate. That's all that matters. Okay, so the last thing is outbound messaging, okay? And when I say outbound messaging, what I mean is that you are trying to get in direct contact with a college coach, right? And so the two ways that we would talk about doing this is either through Twitter DMs, right? Twitter direct messages, or sending emails. Those would be the two primary ways that we're gonna do outbound messaging. Now, I put a ton of emphasis on outbound messaging. Here's the reason why, right? Everyone's like, oh, you should go send a bunch of emails. Has anyone told you why? Like, has anyone said, here's why you're supposed to send emails, right? And to be honest with you, there's a bunch of information out there regarding the recruiting process. Every time you hear someone say something, your first instinct should be to ask why. Because what you're gonna end up learning is that a lot of people are saying things and they have no idea why they're saying them. They're regurgitating information that they heard, and then they're trying to coach it and teach it as if they were the ones who came up with it, and they didn't. They just heard it from someone else, so they're regurgitating it, and they have no idea why they're recommending it in the first place. Ask why. Hey, 3-minute videos are terrible. When you hear me say something like that, and that's actually not true. There are reasons to use 3-minute highlight videos. They just shouldn't be the only videos that you have on your channel. I'm getting on a tangent now, but my point is, if you hear someone say something like that, ask me why. Why, Jack? Why should I do that? Why shouldn't I do that? Actually investigate what people are saying, because you're going to learn that a lot of people are full of crap and they don't know what they're talking about. Okay, let's get back to the matter at hand here, which is, why do I put so much emphasis on outbound messaging? There's two reasons. The first is that you can achieve mass exposure. You can email 100 schools and get exposure to 100 schools in a weekend from your living room couch. You can literally do it from your house. You don't have to go anywhere, and you can achieve mass exposure in a single weekend. Imagine compounding if you did that for every weekend over like 6 or 12 months. You probably wouldn't have any problem getting interest from college coaches, right? So that would be the first piece, is that you can get mass exposure, which is similar to organic social media. The difference is that outbound messaging is much more predictable. Okay, now it's predictable in two different ways. Okay, the first way that it's predictable is that you cannot predict whether coaches are going to reply to your messages or not. Okay, you cannot control that. It's entirely out of your control. But what you can do is increase the odds that coaches open your emails and click on your links, which is then inherently going to increase the number of replies that you get. The open rates and click rates on your emails are predictable, right? If you do these things, X, Y, Z, all the way down, right? If you do those things, then you can achieve a minimum baseline open rate, like a minimum of 60% coaches, and hopefully up to like 90%, right? Click rates, you can get a minimum of 40%, up to 70%, right? So those are predictable numbers. And you can say, okay, if you're tracking this stuff, you can say, okay, well, I got this percentage. If I tweak this one thing, how does that change it? And the percentage goes up. That is predictable. We are using math to give ourselves a better chance of getting a response. That's the first thing when it comes to predictability. The second thing that when it comes to predictability is straight math in terms of volume. So what that means is if you send 10 emails and you get one response, okay, that's a 10% reply rate, which is the status quo in college recruiting. If you 10x the number of emails that you're sending, instead of 10, you send 100, right? Then it is more likely than not that you will 10x the number of responses that you got. So instead of one response, you'll get 10, right? So instead of sending 10 emails and getting one response, you send 100 emails and you get 10 responses. That is predictable math. And you can just say, I'm going to continue to do that until I get the amount of interest that I want. You send 100, you get 10. What if you send 200? Well, you get 20. You just keep going until you get the amount of interest that you feel comfortable with and the schools that you are happy with. That's what that looks like. So part of the reason that we put such a huge emphasis on outbound messaging is that it's predictable, right? We can just play the math game. And so you have the volume, which is if I send 10, and I get one response, that's the volume game. But then there's also the quality game, the efficiency of your marketing. Meaning, what happens if you send 10, but you get 2 responses? You literally double the amount of responses. If that happens, then if you send 100, you get 20 responses, right? That is where the quality of your video strategy, your email strategy, your follow-up strategy, your Twitter strategy, right? Like that's where that comes into play. And the marketing piece then says, how efficient are you with those numbers? And if you're actually tracking metrics, then you can improve the efficiency of your marketing, which is what you're doing. You are marketing yourself as a player. You have to have that mindset. You are marketing yourself as a player. If you're the parent, then you are helping your kid market themselves to college coaches. Okay? So I like math. Math is great. If you have 10 emails and you get one response, just 10x the number of sends, you'll probably 10x the number of responses. Great. These are the 4 ways that you can get on a college coach's radar. If there is something in here if there's something that you're doing that does not fall into one of these buckets, it is probably a waste of time and money. Okay? So this is your new strategy. Your new strategy is that you're going to go send outbound messages to college coaches because you're going to be able to achieve mass exposure and predictability. You're going to send Hail Marys with social media because if one of those posts hits, then you might completely change your recruiting process overnight, and you're going to use social media for recency, showing recent updates of what's going on. The third thing is that you're going to use high school coach referrals for the top 5 schools that you are interested in, and you're really only going to do this if you think that your coach has serious clout. Otherwise, it's just probably not going to be worth your time, though I don't think it's going to hurt you to try. Okay, but you're not going to rely on coach referrals to generate you mass exposure. We already talked about the fact that that's probably not going to happen. And then once you generate a bunch of interest, it becomes way easier to choose which showcases and camps to attend because you know which schools are going to be interested. So you go to the showcases and camps where those schools are going to be in attendance, and when you show up, the deck is now stacked in your favor because they have watched your video, they've liked your video, they've expressed interest, and when there are hundreds of other players there, they're going to watch you. And so now we're using showcases and camps for evaluation. We're not using them for exposure. And all of a sudden, we're not shelling out money into the recruiting process, which is fine. Like, yeah, if you spend money in the recruiting process, you're going to get more interest in offers. It's just how it works. But that shouldn't be the primary way that you are getting interest. Primary way should be that you have an actual strategy. That you're like, this is how I'm going about this. And then you can improve that strategy over time. And then once you then spend money on an improved strategy, you're going to get way more bang for your buck. And you're going to get way more interest in offers than you had previously. Okay. If you want to work with us, or we have other courses and stuff that you can buy, if you're interested in any of that, I'll leave links in the description. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next time.